All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is Asset-Based Storytelling for Nonprofits, a Give Local workshop. Just a quick introduction before we get started. Closed captioning is available for anyone that needs that. It is at the bottom of your toolbar on the Zoom screen. And I'd like to start off today with a quick land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that this gathering is being held on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish tribes, which include the Nisqually, Squaxin, Puyallup, Snohomish, and Skagit, among others. We want to pay our respects to elders, both past and present. We recognize that without them, we would not be here together today. We encourage you to research the tribes wherever you live. So hi, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Mary Lamb. I use she, her pronouns. And for those of you that are listening in, I am a young Latina female. I have brown hair up to my shoulders. I am wearing a plaid jacket today, and I am in my office at the foundation. So behind me, there are just a few images hanging up, as well as a bookshelf. I am the Philanthropy and Communications Officer here at the Community Foundation of South Puget Sound, and my teammate Melissa and I are happy to assist nonprofits with anything that they need as they prepare for their Give Local campaign. My email is here for you on the screen. It's mary@thecommunityfoundation.com, and you can email me anytime. Today, we are joined by Elaine Bradenberg. She is the curator of community storytelling and founder of Window Seat Media. I do have a quick bio for Elaine as well. She is an oral historian, multimedia storyteller, and educator. She has carried out her work through a variety of roles: a development director at nonprofit organizations in the South Sound, a faculty member in the Evergreen State College's MPA and evening and weekend studies programs, and a community-based learning coordinator at high schools in Albuquerque, Portland, Oregon, and Elaine currently works for Window Seat Media as its memory archivist. She holds a bachelor's in cultural and community studies from the Evergreen State College and a master's in interdisciplinary studies, folklore, anthropology, and journalism from the University of Oregon. So Elaine, thank you so much for joining us today. And without further ado, I am going to pass it your way and stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Mary. It's really wonderful to collaborate with the Community Foundation again, and to be with you all this morning. I appreciate you taking some time out of your busy days. I know we're all busy working in the public sector, nonprofit sector. So thanks for taking some time to share the morning with me. I wanted to just share a little bit more about where I'm coming from with this topic, with storytelling. So like Mary mentioned, I have this graduate background, this professional training in oral history and folklore and journalism. And so I've always really loved stories, and this is kind of the academic background that I'm coming from. And in terms of the folklore aspect of my training, I've always been interested in the many ways that we share our stories. So stories not only from the perspective of like verbally how we share who we are, but the many ways that we share who we are in our identity. So that can be through the food that we grow and prepare. It can be through the dances, through music, through all the rituals and traditions that we participate in. All of those things share who we are. They share our identity, our history, our heritage. So I've been interested in all of those things. And that's sort of been my background and where I'm coming from in this field of storytelling. I sort of landed in oral history in particular. That's most of the work that I do in the community. So I facilitate community-based oral history processes and projects in our community. And I've been doing this work for about 6 or 7 years in the South Sound area. And prior to that have worked sort of as a fundraiser in the community. So as a development director. And that work that I did, I really just learned on the job. So I didn't have necessarily professional training in it. I sort of got involved in development work. It sort of intersected in some ways and in a lot of ways in storytelling, the storytelling work that I did. And so I was fortunate enough to have a lot of mentors and worked as a development person for about 8 or 10 years locally here. So I sort of bring that lens and have since been teaching in the MPA program, primarily nonprofit storytelling and fundraising to some extent. So I wanted to also say that I don't necessarily feel like I'm an expert. I'm a lifelong learner. I also feel like you all probably have lots of experience and ideas to bring to our session this morning. So I welcome you to share your own ideas and experience as we move through this time together. And on that note, I noticed a lot of people here are coming from various nonprofits. We have people in the chat who've mentioned that they are grant writers or in communications, development assistants. Is there anybody else who wants to share in the chat other perspectives they're coming from, other roles they're coming from to this storytelling work beyond sort of the communications and development realm? Are there other folks in the room? And you can just add it or say it if you want to just unmute yourself too. It's fine. It sounds like we probably have lots of folks who are focusing on fundraising, which makes sense because it's Give Local time. So that's great. So for our time together today, what I was hoping we could do, I was just going to share a little bit of some ideas, a framework for thinking about how to sort of widen the lens of our storytelling in our sector. So we're often focusing a lot on sort of stories of success, success stories, specifically individuals, how individuals that we work with overcome challenges and get to the other side through, the support of our organizations. And so I wanted to spend some time thinking about how we can sort of widen the frame of our stories and thinking about sort of stories of more collective impact. So how does our organization sort of fit within this larger frame, in relation to other organizations doing the work that they're doing in the community, how multiple people come together really to tackle problems in our community. So again, just widening the frame, moving from more of an individualistic frame to more of a collectivist frame of our storytelling. So I'm going to offer some ideas around that. And then I'll invite you to spend some time together. Either we might stay in the large room or in breakout rooms, depending on how many of us are here. I have a couple of stories that give you examples of different ways, the more sort of portrait style storytelling versus the wider frame storytelling around the same story. So you can see the different impact of those different kinds of stories. So we'll spend some time looking at those two stories and then thinking about the impact of them, and maybe thinking also doing some brainstorming work about some of the stories that you're hoping to tell in your own organization and using some of those tools. So it'll just be an opportunity to practice some of the ideas that we'll be sharing today. And I apologize, I feel like the sun is just kind of coming right through the middle of my face. So sorry about that, I'll kind of lean to the one side. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right. And Mary, if you would be so kind as to just let me know if there are hands raised, that would be really helpful. Or things happening in the chat, you can just interrupt me.
Yeah, no worries.
Great. All right, so we've talked about what we're going to do today. So I'm just going to launch into why stories. So I really feel like we're story animals. I think that, a lot of the way that we move through the world is through the stories that we tell ourselves, about other people. It's really how it's our process of making meaning around the world around us. So our stories really, they express some of our most deeply held values and beliefs. they reinforce a shared sense of identity or purpose or experience. I think we've all had that experience of maybe going through something in our lives and then feeling maybe alone in it, and then sharing that and realizing somebody else has experienced the same thing. And, oftentimes that can be pretty empowering, because now we realize there's other people that have gone through that, and maybe we want to work together to make change. So I think that act of sort of sharing stories to reinforce identity and experience is really powerful. I also wanted to share that thinking about stories as both a product and a process. So in the nonprofit sector, I think we often get caught up in the sort of outputs or the products of our work. And so in the storytelling realm, that would be, maybe the written success story that you have on your website, or maybe it's a video or the photograph that you took of a client. Those are all the products, the stories themselves. But there's this whole process of creating stories. There's the questions that you decide to ask your clients in an interview setting. There's who the person is interviewing that client. So who's asking the questions can really impact what kind of response you might get, the location of where that interview is taking place. Maybe you decide you're going to you're going to set up a workshop for people in your community, and so they can write their own stories, but you're also thinking about what kind of prompts you're offering them that get them thinking about how they're going to write those stories. So there's this whole process involved that's very subjective, and it impacts kind of the final product of those stories. So it's important to think about, there's like two things going on. There's the process of creating the story, and then also the end product on the other end of it. And then stories are unfinished, they're complex, and they're subjective. So what I mean by that is that our stories are changing all the time. So there's no such thing as like a single story or fixed story. I think the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves change a lot. So if we think about who we're talking to, what our audience is, we might decide to, include different things or exclude different things over time, whether we're 12 or 22 or 42. We may tell different stories about who we are. So we're constantly sort of refining and revising our own stories. And so in that way, they're always subjective. There's no one sort of single truth. And one of the important points with this is that, when we think about working with people in our community to ask them to share a story. So say you work with a family and you do a video and it's on your website. It's important to remember that, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, that family might have a really different relationship to the story that they initially told you. Their circumstances might have changed. Their perspective on what happened might have changed. Their perspective on your organization might be really different. So it's just important to remember that, again, our stories are always changing. And it's always a really great practice that if we're thinking about using client stories, that we're checking back with folks, so that, on the internet, things can stay up forever, indefinitely. So, I would encourage you to go through your websites and look and see, is this video like 4 years old? Maybe we should get back in touch with these folks and just sort of check in and see if this story still resonates with their experience. So it's also another great opportunity to just to check in with folks and to sort of build and maintain relationships with the people that you're serving. So it's hard for me to talk about storytelling without talking about framing. And so I think most people are familiar with the term frame, or at least have heard it. And framing really is the process that determines what to include and what to exclude in your story through the use of a variety of devices. So framing devices can be a variety of things. It can be the visuals that you choose. So say you're shooting a video, the different visuals you choose to illustrate your story, the way that you use numbers to strengthen your message, the tone of your story. So if it's a video, what kind of music did you select? Who are your messengers? Like, who did you decide this is the person we want to invite to tell this story? So all of those things are choices that we choose as storytellers. And all of those choices provide context, and context essentially is what really helps your audience understand the problem. So we can think about framing as a camera lens, essentially. And so if we zoom way in, we can think about this personal mode of storytelling, really highlighting an individual person or a client. We can zoom out a little bit and think about more of a communal mode of storytelling. What's the collective? Like, what is the community up to? Where does the person fit within that community? Or you can zoom way out and think about the structural or political context of the story. I don't know if you all have seen that documentary 13th, but that's a great example of sort of the really wide angle political storytelling, where I don't think there's really any personal narrative at all, but it's really about system. It's a story about systems and structures. And all of those different types of storytellings have different kinds of impact. So here's just an example of how this might look visually. So here we have personal, the personal sort of tight zoom in frame mode of storytelling. We sort of zoom out a bit and you see this person in the context of a small but community of people. Looks like they're at a coffee shop, lots of people on their phones. This is a very familiar sight, I think, these days. If we zoom out even further, we see them in the context of this much larger city, so more of the political context. So all of those kind of choices matter. So I don't know if you all are familiar, but George Lakoff is a good reference if you're interested in this idea of framing. He wrote a really accessible book that, is critiqued in some ways in terms of it's very much written for a very progressive audience. So it's pretty hard on the conservative viewpoint. But you could Google him and there's all sorts of resources online, videos and stuff that he's done. But he defines framing as sort of mental structures or mental modes that shape the way that we see the world. So we set goals and define success based on these mental models. And our frames really they evoke ideas, they evoke metaphors, they activate core ideas or core values and beliefs. And the way that framing works is that it gains strength and power through repetition. So the more we use those frames, the more they're sort of solidified in our minds, the more power they receive. And they really reflect sort of a fundamental worldview that we have. I'm going to try and just turn my computer a little so I'm not so in the, I don't know which way I should go. I feel like this light is right in my face. Just a little. I think that's a little better. Okay, so here's two examples of how framing can work with the example of taxation. So this comes from Lakoff's book. So one way of thinking about taxation is, he writes that taxation is an affliction and the person who takes it away is the hero and anyone who tries to stop him is the bad guy. And so the answer, the frame is sort of tax relief. So we need relief from this affliction. And I think we've all heard that quite a bit on both sort of conservative and liberal or progressive sides, is this frame of tax relief, tax relief, tax relief. That's something that's been repeated over and over again. Another way of thinking about taxation is it's paying your dues or your membership fees. If you join a club or a community center, you pay fees. Why? You did not build the swimming pool, you have to maintain it. Otherwise, it won't be maintained and it will fall apart. People who avoid taxes, like corporations that move to Bermuda, are not paying their dues to their country. It's patriotic to be a taxpayer. It's traitorous to desert our country and not pay our dues. So that's another way of thinking about taxation, that it's patriotic, that we must pay our fair share. And I think that's another thing that people have been saying more often is, taxing is about paying our fair share. So you can see there's, really different ways that we can think about issues in our society and different ways to frame them. I'm going to actually skip over this one. So what would you say, realizing I can't really see folks for the chat. So there's a really dominant frame that's activated in most American storytelling. So like a dominant frame meaning a value or belief. Does anyone have any thoughts? If you could put in the chat, although I can't really see the chat at the moment.
I can read them to you, Elaine.
Great. So anybody have ideas of a dominant frame, a value, or a belief that's activated most often in American storytelling? I can see the chat now. So Sarah's saying individualism. Other folks have ideas? Exceptionalism, that's a great one too. Great. So there's this really great organization called the Frameworks Institute, which has helped me really think about different ways of telling stories. And in the research that they've done with 500,000 participants, they really found that individualism to be the most pervasive and stubborn cultural models that Americans hold. So it kind of goes across all the different spectrums of social issues. So individualism still is a very, very dominant frame in our American storytelling, and we see it in all sorts of ways. So there's a great book called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And the author of that book, Hammond, she really says that there's these different modes of kind of organizing or cultural ways of thinking about our world, and individualism being one of them. And she's saying that 20% of the world, mostly European cultures, have this individual cultural worldview. And some of the characteristics that she points out are things like, which I'm sure this sounds familiar to all of you all, focusing on independence and individual achievement, emphasis on self-reliance, the belief that one is supposed to take care of themselves to get ahead. So that idea of sort of the bootstrap idea, which has been very prevalent in our culture here in the United States. That learning happens through individual study and reading, that individual contributions and status are really important. It's more of a competitive, a technical, analytical culture. So those are some of the common attributes of individualism. So how this sort of translates in nonprofit storytelling and also legislative storytelling, if you're in the public sector, is these sort of more success or sort of portrait style stories. So the success stories of individual people that we're serving. And some of the like typical story elements of these success stories is sort of made a little grid of the different elements, story elements. So when you think about the characters of those stories, who the story is about, it's usually an individual who's experiencing many challenges. Another character is often the organization or its donor. They're often presented as sort of the hero of the story, and often as like the expert in the problem also, I think is often how they're presented. The conflict, how the problem's explained, it's most often focuses on a personal conflict. So maybe there's addiction or domestic violence, and it doesn't focus as much on external conflicts. There might be, a little bit of context around, if we're talking about like houselessness, there might be like some statistics thrown in there about, the percentage of people, how many people in town, but they don't. Oftentimes those types of stories don't go deep into the larger problem, the systemic problem with the issue. The resolution, how the solution's presented, is usually emphasizing the organization or the program as the solution. How the work is done is often pretty simplified or it's left out. And as far thinking about like assets, like how we're talking about a community's assets in those stories, they're often very limited. They're limited to just the organization, just the donor, or the individual's self-determination. So there's we very we don't very often see like more assets in our community, more ways that people are coming together to uplift. The settings are usually pretty narrow in those stories. They're the organization, maybe the interviews are in people's offices. We might see just small slices of the individual's home or community. It's a pretty narrow frame. And the theme is usually, of course, we want people to be self-sufficient and we want people to like get on their feet. And, at some point that also kind of emphasizes the individualistic frame. So the themes of those stories often celebrate independence and self-sufficiency. And the point of view are told from the client, most likely. And then again, the organizational voice is usually presented as the expert in the problem. So there's lots of trainings where you can learn this formula. This is one from a training I took about 5 or 6 years ago. And I've used this early on in a lot of my storytelling work. I mean, this is the typical story structure of nonprofit storytelling. And it's very explicit. It says, that you introduce your organization and the donor is the hero of the story, and that the character's life has changed as a result of the organization. And I don't want to say that that isn't also true, like that people do overcome really challenging things and our organizations are amazing and they do amazing work. But I think we just need to think about like how we're structuring that story. Those things can be true, and we can also widen the frame to think more collectively about how these solutions really happen in the context of the community. So some of the impacts of this sort of really tight sort of portrait storytelling is like I said, it reinforces this frame of individualism. It evokes emotions like pity, fear, sympathy, guilt, and those kinds of emotions often lead to fatigue in the end or disengagement over time, which is really the opposite of what we want. They can often result in just a singular transaction. Like, for example, if you're showing a video at a fundraising event, you might get a one-time gift or just, a grant that one time over maybe more deep analysis and transformational change. And these stories often are sort of individualizing issues that are really, really systemic at their core. So frameworks tells us that if we rely on these default understandings of narrative, we'll end up telling stories of individuals who succeed or fail based on their choices and efforts. And if we want better stories for social change, we need to retool the architecture of storytelling to get more of the social into the story. So again, less of that sort of personal storytelling, moving out more of the communal or even further out to the political. So one way to do this, like I said, is to widen the frame to collectivism. We want to emphasize relationships, interdependence, and cooperative learning. Those are 3 things to really focus on. And like we talked about with individualism being sort of 20% of the population, 80% of the world, Latin America, Asia, Africa, Middle East, many of the Slavic countries or cultures practice this sort of collectivist culture. And some of the attributes that Hammond defines for collectivism are really focusing on interdependence, group success, collective wisdom or resources of the group, the belief that group members take care of each other to get ahead. Learning happens through group interaction and dialogue. Group dynamics and harmony are important. And we need to collaborate. It's rather collaborative and very relational. So relationship-based are some of the primary attributes. And none of these things are, they're not supposed to be presented as necessarily dichotomous. I think a lot of cultures can be both, and there's actually like There's another figure in the book where they show like the extent to which different cultures are individualistic or collectivist. But I think the idea is that they're kind of on a spectrum, and you can be both. So it doesn't have to be like a dichotomy or either one or the other. But it's just important to kind of think about the results of each of those types of worldviews. So for these more landscape or stories of collective impact, we're really sharing a collective vision. We're showing cooperation. We're showing the assets of a community, and the many assets it takes to make social change. We're sort of getting under the hood of a social issue to show how just particular systems or structures produce the conditions that need to be changed. And we're explaining how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when we're working together. So these are some of the questions that we can think about and sort of a framework for thinking about how to write these kinds of stories. So we can start with a problem. The structure of the story can really start with a problem. What is the serious challenge that needs to be addressed? We can move into the context of that problem. So what's the size and the scope of the problem? What's its background? So we're not necessarily starting with an individual, which is, the typical sort of success story often starts with the individual story. So here we're talking about the problem and the context first. We're thinking about the solution. So what assets are available to solve the problem, and how can progress be made using all of those different assets? And then we introduce the collective. What group of people came together to solve this problem? And so for, personal storytelling, you can really work with clients to think about, all the people involved in their lives beyond the organization, family members, community members, other people that they've relied on that can, as part of their community. So who are our collective when we think about how we overcome something? The process. So thinking about what work was done, using what assets, and what did everybody do to contribute. So again, broadening that frame. So it's less about like, pulling oneself up by their bootstraps with their own personal assets, but thinking about the assets of the community and the people around them. Who was the leader? So who brought people together? So, that's an important part of a story for sure. And I think we often overemphasize like one individual leader. There often are people who are able to gather people together around a cause. And sometimes that's more than one person. So sometimes there's co-leaders to things, but they don't need to be overemphasized. I think they're, over the collective of the group, what the group did together. We can think about the lessons learned. So what obstacles were overcome, what trials and errors were encountered. And then thinking about the climax of the story, what changes were achieved. And then where do things stand now? What's better than it was? And in the end, sort of what did we learn from this story? So there's a lot more in these kinds of stories. They're longer typically, and I think that's part of the challenge, is that our storytelling modes right now really require very short stories. I mean, right now, I think videos any longer than 2 minutes aren't being watched. So, I mean, it's really hard to really present the complexity of what's going on in such a short time period. So I think that's really the challenge, is that these kinds of stories require people to spend a little bit more time reading or listening or watching. So some of the impact of these types of stories is they really have a tendency to amplify the assets or the cultural wealth of an individual and their communities. And that your assets can be a lot of different things. They can be places, so things like land, building, transportation, all the physical things and the place-based things in your community can all serve as an asset to people. We often think of assets as economic, and clearly that's definitely a part of it. And it's not just what people produce and consume, but all the ways we informally, all the informal economic models like bartering and trading. Mutual aid has been a huge thing recently, or like the buy nothing groups. I mean, all of those things are, I think of those as sort of economic assets, even though there's not necessarily money that's exchanged. Our assets are all our organizations and institutions, whether they're volunteer run or have paid staff. As an oral historian, I really feel like our stories are one of our greatest assets, in terms of like, if we think about all the wisdom that we gain through living through different times and how that's knowledge that we pass down from generation to generation. So thinking about what stories exist within our community, what kind of cultural knowledge, lived experience can be useful to us now. So I think stories are definitely an asset. And then, of course, all the people in our communities, all their skills, all their experiences, thinking again about the collective, like what we all bring. We think about like social justice as almost like an ecosystem. We all have different skills and different gifts that we can bring, and they all work together to create change in our community. Other impacts is that in this wider frame storytelling is that it educates the community about the context of the problem. So we just have a lot more information about what's going on. And I think one of the things that you can do really is think about the systems almost as characters in your story that need fixing. So if that's a helpful way of thinking about it, so you can introduce those alongside individuals as a character in your story. And it really invites your donors to be a part of a shared sense of purpose and hope. So there's really much more potential for long-term engagement in terms of like funding or volunteerism, because these stories are really rooted in the we instead of the other. So the collective we. So just showing that interdependence, like, your liberation is bound up in mine kind of frame of thinking about social change, that we're all kind of in it together, and we all benefit from getting to the other side of these inequities. So again, the context we provide defines whether an issue is public or private. So we have the portrait storytelling, which really defines the issue more in the personal, private realm. And we have the landscape stories that really define them as a public or a collective concern. So the other result is that we're more likely to hold institutions or systems accountable for solving problems when we in taking collective action. So we're often, as much as we want to, with the success stories, we show, that this person has overcome some challenges. On the flip side of that, we can also blame them if later on things don't go as we hope. And so I think that's the flip side of that. So I think if we can move away from that, then, we're really asking our institutions and our systems to solve these problems and to be held accountable. And on the other side of that, just that we're all responsible for being a part of that change making together and making that happen. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Well, I think I'll introduce this activity for a minute, and then I'll come back and stop sharing my screen so I can see y'all. So what I was hoping we could do in this breakout room, if y'all want to stick around, is I do have two stories. One is it's the same event. One is from the perspective of this sort of portrait storytelling, and another one is a landscape story. And so in breakout rooms, what I was suggesting that we do is you have a note taker and a person who might want to read the story aloud. You're welcome to read it to yourself if you prefer, but sometimes it's fun to read aloud. Read both of the stories, and then compare how each unfold. Consider what you noticed about the two approaches to the same story, what you learned about the problem from each story, and what impact did it have on your engagement or your understanding about how change happens in community. And then if you have time, I thought we could spend about 30 minutes in breakout rooms You might want to discuss how you would use landscape or collectivist story elements to widen the lens. So you could brainstorm some ideas in relation to a success story that your organization may want to tell. So think about some of those elements. And then we'd come back together in the main group and kind of reflect on what we talked about in our small group setting. And what I can do is share both the activity that's written out for you, as well as the stories in the chat. So you can have those available for you. So I'm going to stop sharing now so I can see everybody. All right.
Thank you so much, Elaine. I am going to stop recording. So for those of you that are watching the recording later on, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.